business news now. A new UK Prime Minister Liz Truss says no deal to a free trade agreement with the US. It's been a top priority of the new Premier, who took office earlier this month. As Trade Secretary, she trumpeted a pact as the centrepiece of a post-Brexit economic plan, informally dubbed Global Britain. But en route to the US, where she will see US President Joe Biden, Ms. Truss said that negotiations are off for the short to medium term. Later, she stressed that she is prepared to make unpopular decisions in her pursuit of economic growth.
What is important to me is that we grow the British economy, because that is what will ultimately deliver higher wages, more investment in towns and cities across the country. That is what will ultimately deliver more money into people's pockets, and it will also enable us to fund the public services like the National Health Service. And in order to get that economic growth, Britain has to be competitive.
Liz Truss will joining me now to discuss this story and the other business headlines of the day, including the departure of one of Britain's most controversial businessmen, is Arise correspondent Laurie Laird, who joins me from London. Good to see you, Laurie.
Good evening, Charles.
Good evening to you. Let's start with Liz Truss, that ill-fated US trade deal. How important could that have been to the UK economy?
In short, Charles, not all that important, despite the fact that all of the pro-Brexit politicians have spoken at length and for years about the benefits of global Britain. We'll have a free trade agreement with America, with India, with Australia. But a leaked government document in 2018 came from the Treasury Department, said that a free trade deal with the US would add, wait for this, Charles, 0.2% to GDP over the longer term, while the loss of free trade with the EU, which essentially is what Brexit provided, the loss of frictionless trade with the EU, that would hit GDP by 4% over the longer term. So there is, under the best possible scenario, a trade deal with the US was not going to replace that lost trade with the EU. It was never going to happen. And to put that in perspective, trade with UK exports to the EU are 4 times what the UK sends to the US. So while a free trade deal with the US may be helpful on the margin, it's not the same as trading with your biggest trading partner.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's no question about that. But of course, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party have always touted a trade deal with America as a big deal. What went wrong with these negotiations?
I don't think that the negotiations ever got out of the starting block. America was never all that serious about a free trade deal with anybody, much less the UK, particularly with Joe Biden being concerned about what's happening in Northern Ireland, whether the UK may rip up the Northern Irish Protocol. That was always going to make things even more complicated. But the US is not known as a free trader. Joe Biden is not known as a free trader. And in fact, since he's been president, he has talked a great deal, hasn't did much legislatively yet, but has talked a great deal about Buy American, all sorts of tenders, public sector tenders being given to American companies, American jobs. So this is not a government that is going to pursue any kind of a free trade deal. And of course, when America looks at a free trade deal, it is always in America's interest. I think the UK agricultural area would have to put up with some things they don't like GM, genetically modified foods, hormone treated animal meats, things like that are not very popular here. And I don't see America doing a free trade agreement without those sorts of things. Americans have always long coveted a share of the NHS. That probably isn't going to happen.
Yeah, that's a very interesting analysis, because I do recall a few years ago when the issue of GM foods and a possible deal with America was being discussed, and it was very controversial. Now let's move away from the US and from the UK to something we don't usually discuss, Laurie, which is monetary policy in Sweden. But the central bank there may be leading the pack in rate hikes, I understand.
Absolutely. And it's always nice to have an excuse to talk about Sweden's Riksbank, which is the oldest central bank in the world. But what they have done today is fairly extraordinary. They raised interest rates by a full percentage point, taking interest rates from 0.75% to 1.75%. This is the Riksbank was the first central bank to meet in a really, really busy week for central banks. And I think now that the Riksbank has moved a full percentage point, people are thinking, my word, is the Federal Reserve going to do the same? The betting had been on the Federal Reserve raising interest rates by 75 basis points, or 3/4 of a percentage point. But then we got that hotter than expected inflation report last week. So some people are starting to think, could the Fed spring a surprise and raise 100 basis points? And we'll be able to talk about this in just over 24 hours.
And of course, beyond the Fed and Sweden, what about the Bank of England, which is expected to pronounce on rates on Thursday? And we've got less than 30 seconds.
Absolutely, Charles. Busy central bank week, as I mentioned. I don't think the Bank of England will go as much as a full percentage point, but I think we're likely to see 3/4 of a percentage point, which is a bigger margin than the Bank of England has been hiking.
Laurie, thanks very much indeed. Laurie Laird, Arise business correspondent, talking to me from London.